In May of 1947, Daniel Carr felt his compass fail long before he realized something else was wrong. When he reached the ridge, he found a hidden homestead, smoke drifting from a stone chimney, and 7 figures staring at him with a kind of unknowing that didn't seem human. Carr had been mapping property boundaries for the Kentucky Land Office for 12 years. He'd encountered moonshiners, hermits, and families who preferred their privacy. But nothing prepared him for the sounds that emerged when he approached the clearing. The adults spoke in what seemed like language, flowing and deliberate, but the words carried no meaning he could attach to English or any regional dialect he'd encountered across Appalachia. The structures themselves suggested long occupation, a main cabin. Hand-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather stood alongside 3 smaller outbuildings. Chickens scattered across a yard worn to bare earth. A vegetable garden showed careful tending. But the people, they moved with a synchronization that suggested something beyond ordinary family dynamics. When one gestured, others responded as if choreographed. Their communication a blend of those strange vocalizations and elaborate hand movements. Carr later told authorities he knew something was profoundly wrong within the first 5 minutes. The children, he counted 4 initially, watched him with expressions he described as animal wariness. When he attempted basic greetings, English and then simple gestures, they retreated behind the adults. One woman, perhaps 30 years old, though hard living made ages difficult to judge, stepped forward. She spoke for several minutes in that incomprehensible tongue, her tone questioning, but not hostile. He left markers and returned the following day with Sheriff Thomas Gaines and a deputy. The family had not fled. If anything, they seemed confused by the attention, gathering in a tight cluster as the lawmen approached. Gaines attempted communication for over an hour. He later documented that the family appeared to understand they were being addressed, but couldn't grasp the content of standard English speech. The children broke the impasse. The youngest, perhaps 5 years old, approached the sheriff's vehicle and touched the hood with reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. The child turned to the others and delivered what sounded like an excited description, gesturing wildly. The family gathered around the automobile, their language becoming animated, clearly discussing this incomprehensible object. Sheriff Gaines made a decision that afternoon that would unravel 20 years of isolation. He contacted the state social services office in Frankfort. Within a week, investigators armed with interpreters, medical professionals, and legal authority descended on the hollow. What investigators believed they uncovered was later described by some as among the more unsettling accounts of extreme familial isolation in regional records. The family had lived completely cut off from outside society, not merely distant or reclusive, but operating in a reality they had constructed entirely independent of the world beyond their hollow. They had no radio, no newspapers, no calendar that matched conventional time. When asked about the war, about presidents, about anything beyond their immediate environment, they responded with that private language and blank incomprehension. The investigation's first discovery came from county records. The property had been deeded to Elias Thorne in 1898. No subsequent transactions appeared in any official documentation. No tax records after 1932. No birth certificates. No death certificates. No marriage licenses. For 15 years, this family had existed in a bureaucratic void, as invisible to the state as if they'd never been born. The land office records painted a picture that made sense until it didn't. Elias Thorne had purchased 140 acres in 1898 for cash, documented in a leather-bound ledger that still resided in the Harlan County Courthouse basement. He'd been 32 years old. His wife, Rebecca, 26. They'd arrived from somewhere in eastern Tennessee, though the exact town remained unclear in the documentation. Census records from 1900 showed the couple living alone in what the enumerator described as rough conditions, remote location. By 1910, they had 5 children. The census taker that year noted the journey to their homestead required half a day's travel from the nearest settlement, a cluster of mining families called Dorset Junction that no longer existed by 1947. Local newspaper archives filled in fragments. The Harlan Daily Enterprise from October 1923 carried a brief notice about a mining disaster at Dorset Junction. 37 men killed when a shaft collapsed. The entire community essentially died that day, as families relocated to find work elsewhere. 3 years later, another article mentioned a fever outbreak that swept through the remaining isolated homesteads in that region. No specific families were named, but the piece referenced significant losses in the Eastern Hollows. Dr. Sarah Wickham, assigned to the case by the State Health Department, spent weeks reconstructing what happened next. She interviewed elderly residents from surrounding counties, tracked down relatives of families who'd once lived near the Thorns, and pieced together a timeline of progressive isolation. In 1928, a postal worker named George Brennan had been the last documented outsider to visit the Thorn homestead. His route had been discontinued that same year due to insufficient population density. Brennan told Dr. Wickham in 1947 that he'd spoken with Elias Thorn, who'd seemed tired and defeated. The older children, teenagers by then, had watched from the cabin doorway, but hadn't approached. He told me they'd lost neighbors, Brennan recalled. Said it was just his family now for miles in every direction. Asked if I knew when the road crews might extend the county route closer. I told him probably never, and he just nodded like he'd expected that answer. After 1928, nothing. The family vanished from every official record. Property tax notices went unanswered, but the county never pursued collection. The land was worthless for timbering or development, too remote and steep for practical use. The Thorns simply fell through the cracks of bureaucratic attention. Dr. Wickham's interviews with the family's eldest member, a woman who appeared to be in her late 30s, revealed what happened during those silent years. The communication barrier made details difficult, but through patient work with gestures and simple drawings, a story emerged. Elias and Rebecca had aged quickly in isolation. Without medical care or adequate nutrition, the harsh conditions wore them down. The children, 5 siblings ranging from early childhood to mid-teens by 1930, had known no world beyond the hollow. They'd never attended school. Their parents had taught them basic reading from a few books, but as Elias and Rebecca's health declined, education ceased. The siblings had created their own entertainment, their own games, their own ways of understanding the world, and crucially, they'd begun modifying language to suit their needs. Words their parents used seemed inadequate or unnecessary. They shortened some, combined others, invented entirely new terms for concepts that mattered in their isolated existence. By 1935, Dr. Wickham estimated, their language had diverged so significantly from Standard English that mutual comprehension with outsiders would have been nearly impossible. The siblings inhabited a linguistic reality of their own construction, one that made perfect sense within the hollow, but translated to gibberish beyond it. And then came the decision that would doom the next generation. Elias and Rebecca died, most likely in the late 1930s, based on the family's vague temporal references. The siblings, now adults ranging from late teens to late 20s, faced a choice: leave and enter a world they'd never known, or stay in the only home they understood. They remained in the hollow and formed family bonds only within their small group. Linguistic experts from the University of Kentucky arrived in June 1947, recording equipment in tow. Professor Edmund Hayes had studied dialect variations across Appalachia for 20 years, but what he heard in that hollow defied every framework he understood. The family's communication system wasn't simply corrupted English. It was a fully functional language operating on its own internal logic. Hayes documented over 300 distinct vocalizations, each with consistent meaning within the family group. They had words for concepts that didn't exist in English, subtle distinctions between types of silence, specific terms for the way morning light filtered through different seasons of forest canopy. The evolution had been gradual. Hayes interviewed the eldest sister, gradually building a basic vocabulary bridge. She remembered English words from childhood, could still recognize some when Hayes spoke slowly and simply. But those words felt foreign to her now, disconnected from the reality she inhabited. She demonstrated how their language worked. Pointing to a tree, she produced a sound that incorporated both the visual appearance and the practical use. Another sound indicated the same tree in different weather. A third described it in the context of their spatial understanding of the hollow. English required multiple words to convey what their language expressed in single, complex vocalizations. The gestures proved equally sophisticated. A hand movement combined with a facial expression could communicate. "I saw the thing we discussed yesterday near the place where water pools after rain, and it concerns me." Another gesture indicated future intention modified by weather uncertainty. They had developed efficiency that standard language couldn't match, at least not for their specific environment and needs. Hayes noted something else in his reports. The siblings showed no awareness that their communication system was unusual. To them, this was simply how humans spoke. The concept that billions of people communicated differently had no framework in their understanding. They'd created their reality in complete isolation, and that reality was internally consistent and complete. The language had crystallized around 1930, based on the family's descriptions. The 5 siblings had been young enough for linguistic flexibility, old enough to remember fragments of conventional speech. They'd needed to communicate with increasing complexity as they took over homestead management. Their private language filled that need perfectly. But language reveals worldview, and the family's worldview had contracted to the boundaries of their hollow. They had no word for city or government or nation. Concepts like employment or money existed only in the vaguest sense, remembered from their parents' stories, but never experienced. Time itself functioned differently in their vocabulary, marked by seasons and natural cycles, rather than arbitrary human measurements. Hayes spent weeks building a basic translation framework. Simple concrete nouns came first: tree, water, fire, food. Verbs proved more challenging because their language often incorporated intent and result into single expressions. Abstract concepts remained nearly impossible. How do you explain law, or society, or progress to people who've never encountered these things? The youngest brother, perhaps 28 years old, showed Hayes their record-keeping system. Marks carved into wooden planks, tracking seasons and significant events. A mark for when their father stopped speaking. Another for when their mother followed. Marks indicating births, though the family structure that produced those children remained unclear in the early documentation. Hayes made a troubling observation in his field notes. The family's language had been perfectly adequate for their isolated existence, but it lacked vocabulary for external integration. They had no words for asking questions about the outside world because they'd never imagined needing to ask. No terms for expressing confusion about unfamiliar technology because technology hadn't existed in their reality. Their language had trapped them as surely as the Hollow's geography. It reflected and reinforced a worldview so insular that expansion became psychologically impossible. They'd invented a perfect communication system for a world population of 5 adults, and that system now prevented them from joining the larger world that had finally discovered them. The tragedy wasn't that they'd created their own language. The tragedy was that their language had made them unable to imagine any existence beyond the one they'd always known. The marriage revelation came through objects, not words. State investigator Patricia Drummond found them in a wooden chest beneath the main cabin's only bed. 7 braided rings made from human hair, each containing strands of 2 distinct colors woven together in intricate patterns. The rings bore no resemblance to conventional wedding bands. They were ritual objects, clearly significant, created with painstaking care. Drummond showed them to the eldest sister, whose reaction confirmed their meaning. The woman touched each ring with reverence, speaking in that private language while gesturing between different family members. The pattern became sickeningly clear. Court records contained no marriage licenses for any of the Thorne children. Kentucky law in the 1930s required county clerk approval, witness signatures, official documentation. None existed. What happened in the Hollow after their parents died occurred entirely outside legal or social structures. Dr. Wickham approached the topic with clinical necessity. Through careful questioning using their limited shared vocabulary, she established that the siblings had understood reproduction basics. They'd grown up on a working farm, had witnessed animal breeding. When their parents died, they'd faced a stark choice about their future. The eldest sister's attempts to explain revealed a logic that made sense only within their isolated framework. They'd wanted children. They'd wanted the family to continue. The concept of finding partners outside the Hollow hadn't occurred to them, or if it had, the prospect of leaving their known world proved too terrifying to contemplate. One brother, distinguishable by a scar across his left hand, showed investigators a wooden board where he'd carved marks. Dr. Wickham spent hours decoding the system. The marks tracked pairings, births, deaths. 3 of the 5 siblings had formed partnerships. The other 2 remained alone, though their roles in child-rearing appeared communal. The timeline suggested the first pairing occurred around 1935. The eldest sister and the scarred brother. Within their private language and worldview, this union held ceremonial significance. They'd created those hair rings, conducted some form of ritual that satisfied their need for structure. To them, it was marriage in every meaningful sense. A second pairing followed perhaps 2 years later. The youngest brother and middle sister. The third pairing came sometime in the early 1940s. Each union formalized with those braided rings, each producing children who would grow up speaking only the family's invented language. Drummond's investigation uncovered something that explained the complete absence of outside contact. The scarred brother had kept a crude journal, pictographic rather than written. One series of images showed stick figures approaching their hollow, then fleeing. Below it, he'd drawn what appeared to be weapons being pointed. Through painstaking interpretation, the story emerged. Sometime in the late 1930s, likely hunters or lost travelers, had stumbled upon the homestead. The encounter had terrified both parties. The siblings, confronted with strangers who spoke incomprehensibly, had reacted with defensive aggression. They'd fired warning shots, driven the outsiders away. After that incident, they'd established watches, someone always monitoring the approach paths. They'd convinced themselves that the outside world was hostile, threatening, something to be guarded against. Their isolation transformed from circumstance to deliberate choice. The family structure they'd created made perfect sense within their closed system. Everyone had roles. Everyone contributed. The children belonged to all adults collectively, raised communally in their private language. No one questioned the arrangement because no alternative framework existed in their understanding. But the biological consequences of their choices had already begun manifesting. Dr. Wickham's preliminary medical assessments of the younger children revealed concerning patterns, developmental delays, physical characteristics that suggested genetic complications, problems that would only compound with each generation born into this closed genetic loop. The siblings hadn't understood inheritance, hadn't grasped the medical implications of their partnerships. They'd solved their isolation problem using the only resources available, never imagining the price their children and grandchildren would pay. By the time authorities arrived in 1947, 2 decades of intermarriage had created a family tree that was less a tree than a tangled knot, with consequences that medical science was only beginning to understand. Dr. Wickham's medical examination reports, filed with the Kentucky Department of Health in July 1947, documented 11 children living in the Hollow. Their ages ranged from approximately 3 to 14 years old. Not one had ever been seen by a physician until that summer. The oldest child, a girl the family indicated through gestures, was named something that sounded like Kessa, showed signs of untreated conditions that should have received intervention years earlier. She walked with a pronounced asymmetry, one leg noticeably shorter than the other. Her vision appeared severely compromised, though she'd developed compensatory strategies that functioned within the Hollow's familiar terrain. 3 younger children displayed similar physical variations. Dr. Wickham's notes carefully documented observations without sensationalism, but the medical implications were clear. Recessive genetic traits, normally diluted across broader population mixing, had concentrated through multiple generations of close intermarriage. What struck the medical team more profoundly than physical conditions was the children's psychological state. They exhibited none of the typical responses to strangers, no curiosity about the doctor's equipment, no interest in the novel items investigators brought. Instead, they showed wariness, bordering on terror, clinging to the adults and communicating in rapid bursts of their private language. The youngest children had never known anything except the Hollow. Their entire universe consisted of 7 adults, 10 siblings, 140 acres of forested land, and a communication system no one else understood. When Dr. Wickham attempted basic developmental assessments, the children couldn't comprehend the tasks, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the concepts themselves had no framework in their experience. Show me which shape is different. The children stared blankly. Shapes weren't categories in their worldview. Objects had functions, locations, uses. Abstract visual classification didn't exist in their mental architecture. Point to the happy face. Again, incomprehension. Their language had emotional vocabulary far more nuanced than simple happiness or sadness, connected to environmental context and social situations. The crude drawings meant nothing to them. Dr. Wickham realized the assessment tools were worthless. She was trying to measure development using standards these children had never been exposed to. They'd developed according to different metrics entirely, ones that served their isolated existence perfectly, but translated to profound deficits in conventional terms. The children's health conditions had gone entirely unaddressed. Infections that should have been treated had healed poorly or become chronic. Dental problems ranged from minor to severe. Nutrition, while adequate for survival, lacked variety necessary for optimal development. The adults had done their best with available resources, but their best hadn't included medical knowledge or access to care. One boy, perhaps 7 years old, exhibited breathing difficulties that suggested chronic respiratory problems. Another child had what appeared to be an untreated broken bone that had healed incorrectly, leaving permanent damage. These weren't cases of deliberate neglect. The adults simply had no concept of modern medical intervention. Illness was something you survived or didn't, treated with whatever herbs and home remedies their parents had known. The family's isolation had created a feedback loop of declining health and capability. Each generation knew less than the previous one. The original Elias and Rebecca had possessed basic literacy and some connection to conventional knowledge. Their children had grown up cut off from education. The grandchildren were being raised by parents who themselves had never experienced the outside world. When social workers attempted to examine the children separately from the adults, the result was near panic. The children became hysterical, several making sounds that transcended language into pure distress. The adults responded with protective aggression, forming a physical barrier between investigators and children. Dr. Wickham noted in her reports that the family functioned as a single organism rather than individuals. Separating them, even temporarily, caused genuine psychological trauma. They'd developed such interdependence that isolation from the group felt existentially threatening. The medical team faced an ethical dilemma without precedent. These children needed intervention, but any intervention would require destroying the only reality they'd ever known. Helping them meant fundamentally disrupting a family structure that, however problematic from outside perspective, represented their entire sense of safety and identity. The state would ultimately decide that intervention was necessary, but the cost of that decision would prove almost as devastating as the isolation itself. Patricia Drummond spent 3 weeks cataloging the artifacts of the family's invented world. What she documented revealed a society operating on principles that bore no resemblance to the outside culture merely miles away. The family had created a calendar system based on lunar cycles and seasonal markers. Notches carved into a beam in the main cabin tracked what appeared to be months, though the count didn't align with standard 12-month years. They marked time by hunting seasons, by when certain plants flowered, by the arrival and departure of migratory birds. The concept of weeks or standardized months had disappeared from their framework entirely. Their spatial understanding of the world was equally unique. The scarred brother had carved an elaborate map into a large flat stone near the main cabin. It showed the hollow in intricate detail, every hunt, spring, every game trail, every significant tree. But beyond the hollow's boundaries, the map simply ended, not in vague representations of distant places, but in literal blankness. Their world had edges, and those edges were absolute. The family had developed rituals for everything. Morning began with a specific sequence of sounds and gestures, everyone participating in synchronized movements that appeared part greeting and part prayer. Meals followed ceremonial patterns, food distributed according to hierarchies that made sense only within their system. The eldest sister ate first, then the scarred brother, then others in an order that reflected their internal social structure. They'd created their own moral framework. Certain behaviors were clearly forbidden, others encouraged, based on rules that evolved from their experience rather than external religious or legal codes. Sharing resources was fundamental. Individual possessions existed, but remained minimal. Children belonged to everyone. Discipline administered communally. Professor Hayes documented their cosmology through patient observation. The family had explanations for thunder, for changing seasons, for death. None involved scientific understanding or conventional religious belief. Thunder was the sky expressing anger at disruption of natural order. Seasons changed because the world needed rest and renewal. Death was transformation into the forest itself, spirits merging with trees and soil. These weren't primitive superstitions replacing lost knowledge. They were sophisticated explanatory frameworks that satisfied every question the family encountered in their limited environment. Why would they need meteorology when their thunder explanation functioned perfectly for predicting weather patterns they actually experienced? The family had storytelling traditions, tales passed down and elaborated, stories about their grandparents, about the time before isolation, though details had warped through repeated telling in their evolving language. They remembered that people once came from beyond the hollow, but those people had become almost mythological in the retelling. Strange beings who spoke differently and couldn't understand truth. Their concept of truth itself had diverged. Truth was what the family agreed upon, what served their collective survival. The idea of objective external facts that existed independent of their consensus had no place in their epistemology. When they described their world to investigators, they weren't lying or confused. They were reporting their reality accurately according to the only framework they possessed. They'd developed specialized knowledge that impressed even the anthropologists. Their understanding of local plant life surpassed university botanists. They knew which mushrooms were edible, which plants treated specific ailments, where to find particular herbs in different seasons. They could predict weather with accuracy that astonished. Meteorologists, they read animal behavior like language, but their knowledge remained entirely practical, entirely local. Abstract thinking, generalization beyond immediate experience, hypothetical reasoning about situations they hadn't encountered personally had atrophied. The eldest sister could identify every plant within their hollow, but couldn't grasp the concept that similar plants might exist elsewhere. Their world was complete, internally consistent, and utterly functional for their isolated existence. They'd needed nothing else, questioned nothing else, imagined nothing else. They'd created a perfect closed system that answered every question and met every need their environment presented. The tragedy was that this perfect system had prepared them for absolutely nothing beyond its own boundaries, and those boundaries were about to be shattered forever. The interrogation sessions, if they could be called that, revealed motivations that unsettled investigators more than outright malice would have. The adults believed, with absolute conviction, that they'd protected their children from danger. Through weeks of painstaking communication, the eldest sister explained their reasoning. She used drawings, gestures, the limited vocabulary bridge Professor Hayes had built. The world beyond the hollow was remembered through fragments of their parents' stories. Stories about the mining disaster that killed dozens, about the fever that swept away families, about hardship and loss and suffering. Those stories had calcified into doctrine. The outside world was dangerous, unpredictable, hostile. The hollow represented safety, predictability, control. Why would they expose their children to threats when everything needed for survival existed within their boundaries? The scarred brother showed investigators his weapons, rifles so old they'd belonged to his father, maintained with obsessive care, despite limited ammunition. He explained through gestures that he'd kept watch, protected the family from intrusion. The encounter in the late 30s, when strangers had approached, had confirmed every fear. Outsiders didn't understand them, seemed threatening, had to be driven away. Dr. Wickham pressed on the marriages, the interbreeding. The eldest sister's response, translated through their emerging communication framework, revealed thinking that was logical within their isolated perspective. They'd wanted children. They'd wanted family to continue. The only partners available were each other. What else could they have done? The concept that this choice might harm their children genuinely hadn't occurred to them. They had no framework for understanding genetics, no knowledge of hereditary risks. They'd seen some children born with difficulties, but attributed this to natural variation. Every litter of farm animals produced some weaker offspring. That was simply how reproduction worked in their understanding. When Dr. Wickham explained, using simple terms and drawings, what happened when close relatives had children together, the eldest sister's response was heartbreaking. She became agitated, speaking rapidly in their private language to the other adults. The family gathered, clearly distressed, examining their children with new horror. They hadn't known. The realization that their choices had caused their children's difficulties devastated them in ways that transcended language barriers. The scarred brother retreated to the forest for hours. When he returned, his eyes held something investigators described as broken comprehension. But underneath the genuine distress lay something more complex. The adults still believed their fundamental decision had been correct. Yes, they understood now that the marriages had consequences. But leaving the hollow would have had consequences too. Facing the incomprehensible outside world, abandoning their home, risking whatever dangers their parents had described, these alternatives still seemed worse. The youngest brother attempted to explain through their limited shared vocabulary. Fear lived in their understanding like a physical presence. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of losing the only structure that made sense. Their isolation hadn't been just physical. It had been psychological, a fortress they'd built in their minds that kept out anything that might challenge their carefully constructed reality. Patricia Drummond noted in her reports that the family exhibited symptoms consistent with collective anxiety disorder. But disorder implied deviation from normal function. Within their environment, their responses had been entirely functional. It was only when confronted with the larger world that their psychology revealed itself as maladaptive. The state psychologist brought in for evaluation made an observation that stunned the investigative team. The family didn't need intervention to cure dysfunction. They needed intervention because their perfect adaptation to isolation made them incapable of surviving anywhere else. They were like deep-sea creatures brought to the surface, their specialization now lethal. The adults weren't villains. They were victims of circumstance who'd made rational decisions with limited information, creating a closed system that perpetuated itself across generations. They'd loved their children enough to keep them close, and that love had become a prison more secure than any physical barrier. When Sheriff Gaines informed them that the state had determined intervention was necessary, that the children would need to leave the hollow for medical and educational assessment, the family's response confirmed every tragic dimension of their situation. They didn't understand why. The removal began in August 1947. State officials had debated for weeks about methodology, ultimately deciding that gradual separation would prove less traumatic than immediate extraction. They were wrong on every count. The plan involved taking 2 children initially, allowing them to adjust to institutional care, then gradually removing others. Social workers arrived with translators, armed with toys and candy, meant to ease the transition. The children stared at these offerings with incomprehension that bordered on fear. When workers attempted to lead the first 2 children, a boy and girl approximately 8 and 10 years old, toward waiting vehicles, the family's response was visceral. The adults formed that protective barrier again, speaking in rapid, urgent streams of their language. The children began making sounds that the social workers' reports described as animal distress calls. It took 4 hours and the presence of Sheriff Gaines to complete that first removal. The children went screaming, reaching back toward their family, with desperation that transcended cultural boundaries. The adults stood watching, making sounds in their language that clearly expressed anguish, but not attempting physical resistance once authorities made clear that force would be met with arrest. The children were transported to a state facility in Frankfurt, designed for youth requiring special services. The intake reports documented their arrival. 2 small figures clutching each other, communicating constantly in their incomprehensible language, refusing food, refusing interaction with staff. Day 3, the boy stopped speaking entirely. Day 5, the girl followed suit. They'd gone completely silent, not even using their private language with each other anymore. When psychologists attempted assessment, the children stared through them as if looking at nothing at all. Back in the hollow, the remaining family had deteriorated. Dr. Wickham, visiting to check on conditions, found the adults barely functional. They'd stopped most normal activities. The scarred brother sat carving marks into wood, the same gesture repeated thousands of times. The eldest sister rocked continuously, making low sounds that Professor Hayes recognized as their language's expression for irretrievable loss. The state decided against further immediate removals. Instead, they attempted integration education at the hollow itself. Teachers came 3 times weekly, trying to teach standard English, trying to introduce conventional concepts. The sessions proved futile. The children learned some vocabulary through rote repetition, but comprehension remained superficial. They could parrot words without understanding the conceptual frameworks those words represented. The 2 children in Frankfurt hadn't improved. Medical treatment addressed their physical conditions, but psychologically, they'd regressed. They moved through institutional routines like automatons, present but absent. Staff reported that late at night, they could hear the children in their beds making soft sounds in their private language, communicating in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. By October, one of the institutionalized children, the boy, had developed what doctors termed selective mutism across both languages. He'd stopped speaking entirely, stopped responding to any verbal communication. When his sister tried to reach him using their family's language, he turned away as if she spoke nothing he recognized. The state psychologist filed a report recommending against further forced separations. The document argued that the family's psychological integration was so complete that separation constituted genuine trauma with permanent consequences. But the medical necessity remained. The children needed care the hollow couldn't provide. Social services attempted a compromise. Medical professionals would visit the hollow regularly, treating conditions without removal. Educational specialists would work on site, slowly introducing outside concepts. The family could stay together while receiving intervention. The plan satisfied no one and solved nothing. The adults remained deeply traumatized by the August removals, their trust destroyed. The children became more withdrawn during professional visits, retreating into their private communication. The two institutionalized children showed no improvement, trapped between worlds with belonging in neither. Professor Hayes documented the linguistic consequences. The family's private language had begun fragmenting. Under stress and confusion, consistency broke down. Different adults used different versions of the same concepts. Children mixed remembered English words into their communication, creating confusion rather than clarity. Their perfect closed system was collapsing, but nothing coherent was replacing it. They were losing their language, their worldview, their identity, without gaining functional alternatives. The integration wasn't working. It was destroying them. Dr. Wickham's comprehensive medical report, submitted to the Kentucky Department of Health in March 1948, documented consequences that extended far beyond initial observations. The physical conditions were treatable, though some damage was permanent. The psychological impact proved catastrophic. The two children who'd spent 6 months in institutional care showed permanent developmental regression. The boy, now completely nonverbal, exhibited what modern psychology would recognize as severe dissociative symptoms. He followed basic routines, but appeared disengaged and struggled to connect with his surroundings. Staff described him as present, but not inhabited. His sister had developed differently. She'd learned perhaps 50 English words through intensive intervention, could follow simple commands, could identify objects by their conventional names. But this surface functionality masked deeper damage. Psychological evaluation revealed she'd essentially split herself into two people. One who performed English routines mechanically, one who emerged only in private, still speaking their family language to herself in desperate whispers. Neither child could be returned to the hollow. The state determined they'd lost the ability to function in that environment, while failing to gain ability to function in conventional society. They'd become permanently liminal, belonging nowhere. The medical team documented the genetic consequences with clinical precision. Among the 11 children, they identified patterns consistent with increased homozygosity across multiple gene loci. Several children showed characteristics associated with recessive genetic conditions that normally remained masked in broader populations. One child had vision problems, severe enough to require specialized intervention, unavailable in the hollow. Another exhibited bone development abnormalities that would worsen without treatment. 2 children had immune system deficiencies that made them vulnerable to infections their isolated environment had previously protected them from. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Dr. Wickham. The family's isolation had shielded them from infectious diseases while creating genetic vulnerabilities. Exposure to outside pathogens during intervention had sickened several children with illnesses their systems couldn't effectively fight. Integration was literally making them sick. The psychological assessments revealed damage that transcended simple measurement. The children who remained in the hollow showed signs of collective trauma. They'd watched family members taken away. They'd experienced violation of their only known social structure. They'd learned that their world wasn't safe, wasn't secure, wasn't controllable. Their language use had changed fundamentally. Professor Hayes noted they'd stopped creating new words, stopped elaborating expressions. The language had frozen, becoming ritualistic rather than communicative. They repeated familiar phrases like protective incantations, but the creative evolution that had characterized their linguistic development had ceased. The adults had deteriorated further. The eldest sister had developed what appeared to be early-onset dementia, though stress and trauma likely accelerated cognitive decline. She confused past and present, sometimes speaking to her parents as if they were present. The scarred brother had become increasingly isolated even within the family, spending days in the forest alone. State officials faced impossible choices. Leaving the family in the hollow meant children wouldn't receive necessary medical care. Removing children meant psychological destruction. Forcing integration meant obliterating the only functional framework the family possessed. There was no solution that didn't inflict profound harm. By 1952, additional children had been removed for medical treatment. Each removal followed the same pattern: initial resistance, traumatic separation, institutional placement, psychological deterioration. The state facility in Frankfurt had an entire ward dedicated to the Thorn family children, Mannes, successfully integrating, all existing in permanent limbo. The adults remaining in the hollow had given up maintaining their homestead. Buildings fell into disrepair. Gardens went untended. They'd lost purpose, lost structure, lost the will to continue patterns that had sustained them for decades. Dr. Wickham's final report, filed in 1954, contained a paragraph that summarized the tragedy with devastating clarity. We discovered a family that had adapted perfectly to extreme isolation. Our intervention, though medically and legally necessary, destroyed that adaptation without providing functional replacement. We saved them from physical deterioration while inflicting psychological annihilation. The question of whether intervention was ultimately beneficial remains unanswerable and will haunt everyone involved for the remainder of our lives. Medical science could treat their bodies. Nothing could repair what isolation had created and integration had destroyed. By 1965, the hollow stood empty. The cabins remained, slowly surrendering to weather and forest reclamation. Vines climbed walls that had sheltered 3 generations. The carved stone map, that intricate representation of a world with absolute boundaries, gathered moss until the details became illegible. The Thorn family had scattered across Kentucky's institutional system like seeds thrown on barren ground. None found purchase. None truly took root in the world that had discovered them. The eldest sister died in 1957 at a state care facility in Louisville. Her death certificate listed pneumonia, but staff reports suggested she'd simply stopped engaging with survival. She'd learned perhaps 20 English words in 10 years of intervention, spent her final months making sounds in the family language to an empty room, having conversations with people who weren't there. The scarred brother outlived his sister by 3 years. He'd been moved to a facility for individuals requiring supervised care after repeated attempts to walk back to the hollow. Each time, authorities found him miles into the forest, moving with certainty toward a home that no longer functioned. His final attempt, in winter 1960, ended when searchers found him hypothermic and disoriented. He died 6 months later, having never spoken again after that last failed journey home. Of the original 5 siblings, only 2 survived past 1965. Both resided in long-term care facilities. Both had learned functional English vocabulary. Both could perform basic tasks, follow routines, exist within institutional structures. Neither had successfully formed connections with anyone outside their original family. They moved through their days like ghosts, present, but fundamentally absent. The children's outcomes varied, but followed predictable trajectories. Those removed youngest adapted most successfully, though successfully remained relative. Several learned English adequately for basic communication. A few attended special education programs, acquiring literacy and practical skills. None achieved what researchers would term normal socialization. The oldest children, those who'd spent more formative years speaking only the family language, never bridged the gap completely. They existed between linguistic worlds, fluent in neither. Some retained fragments of the private language, speaking it to themselves in moments of stress. Others had lost it entirely, that elaborate communication system dissolving like morning fog when separated from its native environment. The two children first removed in 1947 represented the intervention's most profound failures. The boy never regained speech in any language. He lived in institutional care until his death in 1973, a silent presence who'd retreated so far inward that no one could reach him. His sister learned survival English, but nothing more. She worked in a facility kitchen for years, performing tasks competently, but never initiating conversation, never forming relationships, never existing as more than a functional mechanism. By the mid-60s, researchers from universities across the country had studied the Thorne case. It appeared in psychology textbooks, linguistic journals, medical publications. The family became an example, a cautionary tale, a data point in discussions about language acquisition, genetic consequences of inbreeding, and the limits of human adaptability. But the academic interest felt hollow to those who'd witnessed the human cost. Professor Hayes published his linguistic findings in 1962, a comprehensive analysis of the family's invented language. The paper was academically significant, professionally acclaimed. Hayes never wrote about the subject again. In private correspondence, he admitted the research felt like documenting a beautiful structure while it burned. Dr. Wickham maintained contact with surviving family members until her retirement in 1970. She visited them quarterly, these individuals, who'd once been part of a functioning whole, now scattered across institutions like shrapnel from an explosion. She watched them age prematurely, watched their health decline, watched them exist without ever truly living. In her final report, filed with the Kentucky Historical Society in 1976, she wrote about the impossibility of the choices everyone had faced. Leave them isolated and watch preventable conditions worsen. Intervene and destroy. The only framework they possessed for making sense of existence. There had been no good options, only different varieties of harm. The hollow itself became county property after years of abandoned status. In 1972, a logging company expressed interest in the timber rights. A surveyor visited, the first person to enter the clearing in years. His report mentioned the structures, the carved stone, the sense of lingering presence. The logging rights were never pursued. Today, if you know where to look in eastern Harlan County, you can still find traces. Foundation stones where the main cabin stood, metal artifacts corroded into abstract sculptures. That carved stone map, still visible if you clear away decades of forest debris. The hollow remembers, even if no one living does. The last surviving member of the original family died in 1989. The obituary listed her as a ward of the state. No known relatives. It didn't mention the language she'd helped create, the world she'd once inhabited, the family that had functioned perfectly until the outside world arrived. Their story asks questions without comfortable answers. What do we owe isolated communities? When does intervention become destruction? Can you save someone by dismantling their entire reality? The Thornes created a complete world in one Kentucky hollow, and that world died the moment it was discovered. If you found this story as haunting as we did, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten histories that challenge everything we think we know about family, language, and what it means to be human. These stories need to be remembered, even when, especially when, they make us uncomfortable. Because somewhere in the gap between their world and ours lies truth about isolation, connection, and the fragility of the realities we build to survive.